I am here today because I want to tell you the story of HHHolmes. His name was Herman Webster Mudgett. He's also known as the first serial killer in the USA. Born May 16, 1861 in New Hampshire. He was later known as Henry Howard Holmes or H.H. Holmes. His family was from Great Britain, and the Irish McMudgetts dropped the Mick from the last part of the name once they settled in New England. Different sources I've read put his date of birth either at 1860 or 1861. He was said to be a very smart boy and also a loner. He was also early on very curious in a creepy way around small animals. Like most serial killers, he would perform experiments on them. He would even disembowel them while keeping them alive so he could sort of study it. He was the middle child of his family, which was led by an alcoholic and abusive father. His mother, on the other hand, was well educated, a teacher from a good family. There's this weird tale about Herman and his family. They grew up in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, and it was at one time part of the Underground Railroad, aiding African American slaves in their escape from slavery. The tunnels were actually connected to many of the holes in Gilmanton, still in use in the 1880s when he was there. It seemed that Levi Mudgett, his father, felt that he'd been swindled out of his land by the town's elite. The town leaders had begun disappearing gradually over a period of time, never to be seen again. It was said that Levi forced Herman to help him murder and bury these bodies deep in the tunnels. Many homes in the areas were raised to connect the tunnels, and it seems Mudgett's was one of them. Since the tunnels were historic landmarks, they couldn't be disturbed, so anything buried deep inside remained deep inside. There's another tale about Herman and his childhood. He was considered kind of an odd boy. He was inquisitive and he liked to study. He was a nerd, but a weird nerd. It made him the perfect target, though, for bullies. And one time he was being chased as he ran home, and he ran into the doctor's office. Now, doctor's offices at those times were served also as laboratories, so they weren't that quaint little nice sitting area and then you went back in the office. So they ran in there, and the boys grabbed at a sheet that was sort of draped over what they thought was a pile of laundry. I don't know what they were going to do with Herman around it. But a dead, decomposed body was exposed and rolled off the table onto the floor. The boys fled out of the office screaming. However, Herman was curious and began to examine the body. And when Dr. White came back in, he saw Herman on the floor looking at the body, calm and kind of unafraid. And instead of creeping him out like it would have me, he thought that it could make him an inquisitive and interesting boy, and that he might make a good doctor. So he took him on as an assistant and even let him assist him in surgery. Later, Herman Mudgett went to medical school in Michigan, where he would meet his friend Edmund Buckley, who would later become known as Sir Edmund Buckley of Maudway. Their friendship would last the rest of Herman's life. Buckley and Mudgett created this insurance con in college, where they would take out an insurance policy on the cadavers at the medical school, and then they would deform them or carve them up somehow and claim an insurance form for them. It's one of the things that cemented their relationship, their friendship. Holmes' love of cadavers almost got him permanently kicked out of medical school, but he finally did graduate from the University of Michigan Medical School in 1884. Mudgett had married Clara Lovering in 1878, and they had a son, Robert Lovering Mudgett, on February 3rd, 1880. It is said that Herman was very violent toward her, and in 1884, she took Robert and went home to live with her family. Years later, she would say she had nothing to do with him after that. Herman was a ladies' man and had 2 common-law wives after her. After medical school, Mudgett was believed to have orchestrated his first human kill. He briefly taught school in Moore's Forks, New York. He had with him for a brief time a young boy, who subsequently disappeared and was never seen again. Now, Holmes told the authorities that the child went home, but there was no record. So right after he was questioned, Holmes left town immediately, and he went to Philadelphia. And there he took a job in a pharmacy. And while he was working at the pharmacy, another small boy died after taking a medicine that Mudgett gave him. Herman denied having anything to do with it, but again, right after he was questioned, he left the city. And this time, he changed his name to Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. In 1886, Holmes went to Chicago, and this is where the serial killer was born. Now, when he arrived in Chicago, he got a job at Elizabeth Holton's pharmacy. It was located in the Englewood neighborhood at the corner of South Wallace Avenue and 63rd Street. Today, there sits a U.S. post office at the locale. Eventually, Holmes bought the store, and there were rumors that he killed Holton and her husband, but it's not true. Elizabeth Holton's husband was a Michigan University Medical School alumni. So the Holtons retired and lived in Englewood well into the 20th century. Holmes also purchased a vacant lot across the street and constructed a building that was to become the Castle of Horrors. He created a 2-story building with apartments on the second floor and retail spaces on the first. This included a new pharmacy. He began work on a 3rd floor, but it was never completed, so to what degree or what he did up there, I'm not really sure. In this building, he included secret passageways and hiding spaces, and he used it to hide supplies from the furniture companies. Between the architects and the rest of the suppliers, Holmes was notorious for not paying people. He didn't pay his contractors. His building made the press because of this, and including the lack of payment, the rest of the investors pulled their money from the project. Holmes filed for divorce from Clara, but it was never finalized. It didn't stop him, though, from marrying Myrta Belknap and having a daughter with her in 1889. They set up home in Wilmette, Illinois. Now, without divorcing Myrta, he married one more time in 1894 to Georgiana York. He was still married to both Clara and Myrta at the time. Now, there is a period of time that H.H. Holmes could not be accounted for in Chicago. It was right around 1888-ish. H.H. Holmes went to visit his old school buddy, Edmund Buckley, in London, England. This period sounds familiar, right? Well, it's also the period of Jack the Ripper at the East End of London. Interestingly enough, Whitechapel is where the wealthy family of Edmund Buckley came from. And according to census records, Holmes had a residence in Whitechapel about that time. Now, Buckley and Holmes again were selling bodies to medical schools and hospitals. And after trying to sell a body to a local hospital, a formal complaint was filed against him, placing him in that area right around the time of the murders. Now, Jeff Mudgett, Holmes's great-great-grandson, had a letter called Dear Boss. It was analyzed and it came back with a 97% chance of being written by H.H. Holmes. It was also being accepted as being written by Jack the Ripper. Supposedly, there was proof in H.H. Holmes' journal that set up the Ripper murders to actually distract the public from his targeting of rich women. Now, he had developed a youth serum, and he targeted rich women because their organs would be in better condition for the serum. The journals haven't been released yet, so I guess more will be revealed. One of the ways Holmes made money was to kill and dismember his victims. He would strip the flesh and assemble the skeletons, and then he promptly sold the skeletons to medical schools. Ned Connor went to work for Holmes with his wife Jane Smith, who became the first victim of the Castle of Horrors back in Chicago. First, though, Jane became Holmes' mistress. Connor found out about the affair, quit, and moved away, leaving Jane and their daughter Pearl behind. Now, Pearl was little, like under 2. Jane and Pearl disappeared December 24th, 1891, and were never seen again. Holmes related she died during an abortion, ... His next lover was Emmeline Segrand. He hired her to be a secretary and then sealed her in a vault until she suffocated. Soon after that, the University of Chicago got a new female skeleton. Edna Van Tassel was another lover that was never heard from again. It was kind of dangerous loving Dr. H.H. Holmes. Minnie Williams was a woman that was coming into some property in Texas. He hired her as a stenographer, and she also became his mistress. He was able to persuade Minnie to transfer the property over to one of his many aliases, Alexander Bond. Later, they rented an apartment as if they were married, and then she invited her sister Nanny to visit. Neither woman, Minnie nor Nanny, was ever seen again. The skeletons were assembled and sold to medical schools for sometimes upward of like $200, which by today's money is a little over $5,000. And think about it, land was about $150 an acre. Now, granted, this depended on where you bought it, but $150 an acre, $200 right there would buy you a little over an acre of land. In 1893, the Columbian Exposition, or the World's Fair, was held in Chicago. The castle was renovated with the most modern of furnishing, which ones, of course, he would never pay for. Holmes was fast becoming friends with a family called the Petzl family, and he took several of their children to the fair. It was a great way to advertise to elderly visitors from other cities that he had a place with modern furnishings that they could, like a hotel where they could spend the night. They could stay at the beautiful hotel in a soft bed while they enjoyed the fair. Now, mostly these were elderly women, and they were new to Chicago, and of course their families knew they were going to the fair, so they wouldn't be checking on them for a little while, and they checked into the hotel and they never checked out. Now, he made his homes into these sleeping chambers. They were soundproof and had open gas lines that went into the room. He would let them into their rooms, lock them in, and turn on the gas to asphyxiate them. The rooms had peepholes, so he would watch them as they died, screaming for help. His undoing was in this new family that he'd met, the Petzl family. He hired Benjamin Petzl. Benjamin was a petty criminal who worked at anything, really, to feed and care for his wife and 5 children. Though at first I found this devotion to his family kind of admirable. His ability to look the other way at Holmes' horrific crimes kind of removed any nobility the man had. And ultimately it cost him his life and the lives of 3 of his children. He connected to Holmes as a carpenter through a one-ad in the newspaper while Holmes was building the castle, and they became fast friends. Later, the district attorney would refer to Petzl as a tool of Holmes. Now, Holmes got this idea that he would fake Petzl's death and collect the insurance money of $10,000. It was an agreement between the 2 men in which he would pay $500 to Petzl's wife so the family could move and start over. Over time, Petzl's drinking problem, though, had become significantly worse, and Holmes was increasingly afraid he couldn't keep his mouth shut. So he would be talking about the murders and the various deeds that Holmes had Petzl do for him, and the 2 were constantly fighting because of this. By the end of the saga, Holmes had really murdered Petzl, slept with his wife, and killed 3 of their children. It was Petzl's murder that finally took Holmes off the streets. While trying to convince Petzl's wife that her husband had left her and gone to London, and acting shocked about the disappearance of 3 of their children, Holmes was being investigated. One Philadelphia policeman would become famous for catching Holmes. His name was Detective Frank Geyer. Holmes during this time was married to 3 women with rental properties all over the place, and they became dumping grounds for his bodies. His wives managed to survive and live long lives. They were never part of his murder scheme. He was caught on November 17, 1894, and was hanged on May 7, 1896. He was convicted of Petzl's murder, but confessed to killing 27 people. An interesting note about Holmes is that he requested that he be buried in a cement brick coffin 10 feet down, so people would not dig him up and dissect his body. His request was honored, oddly. Amid rumors that Holmes had indeed escaped even death, his body was dug up in 2017, and with DNA testing from relatives, it was determined that it was H.H. Holmes buried in his grave.